it made it quite easy. I mean, it was sort of, I mean, many women that I know have had an experience like that or similar to that, where you love someone and it just doesn't come back.
The image was grainy, yet unmistakable. In April 2005, a paparazzi lens captured Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie on a remote beach in Kenya. For Jennifer Aniston, it was the moment the tabloid speculation she had dismissed became an undeniable reality. After 5 years as Hollywood's golden son, the light was shifting. This isn't just a story of a breakup, but of how one woman survived the world's most public betrayal with her dignity and her voice entirely intact. The sensitivity chip and the great reveal. In the immediate wake of the split, the public expected a breakdown. What they got instead was a masterclass in quiet observation. The exposure of Brad Pitt didn't happen through a leaked tape or a vengeful memoir. It happened through a singular legendary interview with Vanity Fair, where Jennifer Aniston finally addressed the elephant in the room: the missing sensitivity chip. This phrase would go on to define the narrative of their divorce for 2 decades, serving as the first time Aniston peeled back the curtain on the man the world thought they knew. To understand why this was so explosive, one has to look at the timing. While Aniston was grieving the loss of her marriage in private, Pitt was participating in a 60-page editorial for W magazine titled Domestic Bliss. The photo spread featured Pitt and Angelina Jolie playing house in a 60s-style suburban setting, complete with a brood of children. It was a stylized, high-fashion announcement of their new reality, released while the divorce papers were still being processed. For Aniston, the exposure wasn't about the affair itself. It was about the calculated lack of empathy required to flaunt a new life before the old one had even been cleared away. The sensitivity chip comment wasn't just a witty remark, it was a surgical strike. It painted Pitt not as a villain, but as someone dangerously disconnected from the emotional consequences of his actions. In the documentary of their lives, this section marks the shift from Aniston as the victim to Aniston as the truth-teller. She revealed that the man she married had become unrecognizable to her. She described him as someone who had simply checked out, moving on to a new project with the same intensity he once applied to her. This wasn't just a husband leaving a wife. It was the dissolution of a partnership where one person had stopped valuing the other's humanity in favor of a new, shinier narrative. Interestingly, this section of the story also exposes the mechanics of Hollywood image-making. At the time, Pitt's team was working overtime to frame the split as an amicable evolution. They wanted the public to believe that 2 people had simply grown apart. However, Aniston's willingness to call out the inappropriateness of the W magazine spread blew that facade apart. She exposed the coldness behind the golden boy's smile. She forced the audience to look at the discrepancy between the cool guy persona Pitt projected and the reality of a woman who felt her years of loyalty were being dismissed as a footnote in someone else's epic romance. The most interesting aspect of this exposure is that it wasn't loud. In magazine journalism of the mid-2000s, it was rare for a star of Aniston's caliber to be so candid about her hurt without sounding bitter. She managed to expose Pitt's emotional absence while maintaining her own grace. She spoke about the phases of her grief, the anger, the confusion, and the eventual realization that she could not control his choices. By doing so, she indirectly exposed the power dynamic of their marriage. It became clear that while she was building a home, he was looking for a destination. As this section unfolds, we see the ripple effect of her words. The sensitivity chip became a cultural shorthand for the way men in power often navigate breakups, moving on with a sense of entitlement that ignores the wreckage left behind. This wasn't just Jennifer's story. It became a relatable anthem for anyone who had watched a partner rebrand their life overnight. The exposure of Pitt was subtle but devastating because it didn't attack his character through lies. It simply held a mirror up to his public behavior. Furthermore, this period exposed the fracture in their professional lives. They weren't just a couple, they were a corporate entity. Their production company, Plan B, was supposed to be their joint legacy. Yet, as the divorce progressed, it became clear that Pitt was taking the reins of their professional future just as he had taken the reins of his personal life. Aniston's quiet exit from the company she helped build spoke volumes. It exposed a lopsided reality where, despite being equal stars, the visionary roles were often reserved for the man, while the woman was expected to play the supporting role of the supportive spouse. By the end of this first chapter of The Fallout, the world saw Brad Pitt differently. He was no longer just the charming lead. He was a man who could be incredibly cold when he decided the scene had changed. Aniston didn't have to scream to make this point. She simply stood her ground, answered the questions, and let his own actions do the heavy lifting. It remains the most fascinating part of the saga because it was the moment the perfect Hollywood husband was exposed as a human being with profound and perhaps callous flaws. While the world focused on the sensitivity chip he lacked, the real mystery lay in the Friends finale he barely attended. Behind the Friends curtain. The end of Friends in 2004 was more than just the conclusion of a television era. For Jennifer Aniston, it was the collapse of her primary support system just as her personal life began to fray. To the public, she was the highest-paid actress in television, a woman who had everything. But behind the scenes, the final season of the show was colored by a growing, chilling silence at home. This section of the story exposes the stark contrast between the camaraderie on the Warner Brothers lot and the isolation she felt within the walls of her Beverly Hills mansion. It is a well-documented piece of Hollywood lore that while the other 5 cast members' spouses were frequent fixtures on set during those final emotional weeks, Brad Pitt was noticeably absent. He didn't show up for the final filming, a move that Aniston's friends and colleagues later looked back on as the first true red flag. While Jennifer was grieving the end of a decade-long journey with her work family, her husband was already mentally and physically miles away, deep in the desert of Morocco, filming Mr. and Mrs. Smith. This period exposes the specific type of loneliness that occurs when a partner checks out before the relationship actually ends. In her later reflections, Aniston hinted at a shift in the energy, a coldness that replaced the golden couple warmth. The most interesting aspect of this transition was how the media attempted to fill the silence. Because they couldn't see the internal rot of the marriage, they invented a narrative that was easier to sell: the career-hungry woman versus the family-oriented man. For years, the tabloids insisted that the marriage ended because Aniston refused to have children, preferring to focus on her post-Friends movie career. This was perhaps the most painful exposure of all, not of Pitt's actions, but of the industry's inherent sexism. In reality, Aniston has since clarified that she was going through grueling private struggles with IVF and fertility treatments during that exact time frame. While she was being painted as the selfish wife who didn't want a family, she was actually trying to build one, all while her partner was becoming increasingly infatuated with a co-star who represented a completely different lifestyle. The filming of Mr. and Mrs. Smith acted as a vacuum, sucking Pitt out of the orbit of his marriage. Aniston later recalled that when she asked him about the rumors regarding Angelina Jolie, he was honest in a way that was devastatingly simple. He was finding himself. This phrase is often used as a euphemism for abandonment, and in the context of their high-profile life, it exposed a fundamental imbalance. While Jennifer was finishing a chapter, the show, and looking to start a new one with her husband, Brad was looking for a total reinvention. The exposure here lies in the timing. Aniston was at her most vulnerable, transitioning from the safety of a sitcom into the uncertainty of a film career, and the person who was supposed to be her anchor had become a stranger. She described him as checking out emotionally, a slow-motion exit that left her questioning her own reality. The documentary of this marriage shows that the split didn't happen in 2005 on a beach in Kenya. It happened in the dressing rooms of Stage 24, where Jennifer would finish a scene about love and friendship and return to a home that felt increasingly empty. This section also highlights the professional friction that began to surface. Pitt's interests were pivoting toward gritty, Oscar-bait dramas and international humanitarianism, a sharp departure from the breezy commercial world Aniston occupied. He began to view their life together as uninteresting. In a 2011 interview with Parade, Pitt himself would later admit he wasn't living an interesting life during that marriage, a comment that many saw as a direct slight to Aniston. By exposing this mindset, we see that the marriage didn't just end because of an affair, it ended because one person decided the other was no longer enough to keep them entertained. Ultimately, the Friends era ended with a whimper rather than a bang. As the cast took their final bows, Aniston was facing a future where her two biggest constants, her job and her husband, were vanishing simultaneously. It was a period of profound exposure, revealing that even the most admired woman in America could be blindsided by a partner who had simply decided he wanted a different version of himself. While Jennifer was mourning the loss of her old life, the media was busy building a battlefield for her new one. The architecture of a media war. The media landscape of 2005 didn't just report on the Aniston-Pitt divorce, it industrialized it. This was the era of the Team Jen versus Team Angelina phenomenon, a marketing masterclass that turned a private tragedy into a global spectator sport. If you walked into a Kitson boutique in Los Angeles at the time, you were greeted by stacks of high-end t-shirts forcing you to choose a side. This section of the story exposes the brutal architecture of the mid-2000s gossip industry and how it successfully turned Jennifer Aniston into a tragic archetype for profit. The exposure here isn't just about Brad Pitt's actions, but about the machinery that allowed him to pivot while Aniston was pinned to the ground by public sympathy. The media created a binary narrative: the sad, scorned wife versus the exotic, dangerous temptress. By casting Aniston in the role of the victim, the press actually stripped her of her agency. They focused on her loneliness and her biological clock, creating a relentless cycle of pity that was, in many ways, just as damaging as the betrayal itself. Behind the scenes, the PR war was being fought with surgical precision. While Aniston stayed relatively quiet, leaning on her inner circle of friends, the Aniston Army, Pitt's transition into Brangelina was being framed as a grand global awakening. The media allowed Pitt to bypass the cheater label by focusing on his new role as a humanitarian and a father. This exposed a glaring double standard in how Hollywood treats its male and female stars. Pitt was allowed to evolve, while Aniston was expected to remain frozen in her grief, a perpetual Rachel Green who couldn't catch a break. The architecture of this media war was built on the rise of the super paparazzi. During this period, the price of a photo of Aniston looking sad or distraught skyrocketed. Agencies would follow her every move, waiting for a single tear or a downcast glance to validate their narrative of the jilted woman. Aniston has since reflected on this period as a form of PTSD. She wasn't just losing a husband, She was losing the ability to walk down the street without being viewed as a cautionary tale. The exposure of this dynamic shows how the industry commodified her pain, turning her divorce into a multi-million-dollar revenue stream for magazines like Us Weekly and People. Crucially, this section highlights how Aniston eventually broke the machine. She realized that as long as she played the role of the victim, the media would keep her in that box. Her 2025 reflections often touch upon the jarring nature of that era, a time before social media allowed celebrities to speak directly to their fans. She was at the mercy of editors and photographers who needed her to be miserable to sell copies. By refusing to give the vulnerable tell-all interview everyone was clamoring for, she began to dismantle the architecture of the war. She chose silence as a weapon, exposing the media's desperation by simply not feeding the beast. The industry impact of this split cannot be overstated. It changed the way celebrity publicists handled crises. Before Pitt and Aniston, a divorce was a scandal to be buried. After them, it was a brand to be managed. The Team Jen campaign was perhaps the first time a celebrity's personal life was marketed with the same strategy as a blockbuster film. It exposed the fact that in Hollywood, truth is often secondary to the story that generates the most clicks, or in 2005, the most newsstand sales. Even more interesting is the role of the other woman in this architecture. While the world was busy pitting two women against each other, the man at the center of the storm was largely spared from the vitriol. The media war was designed to keep the focus on the female rivalry, effectively shielding Pitt from the brunt of the accountability. This section of the documentary exposes that diversion tactic. By focusing on the catfight, the public was distracted from the reality of a marriage that had been systematically dismantled from the inside. As we look back through a modern lens, the 2005 media war looks less like journalism and more like a public execution of a woman's privacy. Aniston's survival of this period is what ultimately solidified her legacy. She didn't just survive Brad Pitt. She survived an entire industry that was betting on her downfall. The architecture of that war eventually crumbled, not because the media grew a conscience, but because Aniston outlasted the narrative. She proved that you could be the scorned wife and still come out the other side as the most powerful woman in the room. As the headlines began to fade, Jennifer realized that the only way to stop being the story was to start running the studio. The pivot to catharsis. For Jennifer Aniston, the transition from being a tabloid subject to a Hollywood mogul wasn't a stroke of luck. It was a survival strategy. In the wake of her divorce, she found herself at a crossroads. She could either remain the unfortunate face of a love triangle, or she could use the very industry that had scrutinized her to reclaim her autonomy. This section of her journey, the pivot to catharsis, exposes how she transformed her private pain into a professional empire, effectively out-earning and outlasting the drama that threatened to define her. The first step in this reclamation was, ironically, a film called The Breakup, 2006. At the time, critics called it a risky move, life imitating art too closely. But for Aniston, the project served as an emotional purge. By playing a woman navigating the messy, mundane details of a dissolving relationship, she was able to perform her grief in a controlled environment. It was a meta-commentary on her own life that allowed her to have the final word without saying a thing to the press. This role exposed a new side of her talent, a raw, grounded vulnerability that resonated with millions who had felt similar heartbreak. She wasn't just Rachel Green anymore. She was a woman who understood the weight of a closing door. However, the most significant exposure during this period was the quiet dismantling of Plan B Entertainment. When they were married, Pitt and Aniston founded the production company as a joint venture. It was meant to be their shared legacy. Yet, as the divorce finalized, Aniston walked away, leaving the company solely in Pitt's hands. To the outside world, it looked like another loss for Jen. In reality, it was a strategic exit. She realized that to truly be free of the Brad and Jen brand, she had to build her own house. She soon founded Echo Films, and with it, she began to curate a specific kind of narrative. Stories about complicated women, female friendships, and the resilience of the human spirit. This was her professional FU to the industry. While Pitt was off producing highbrow, male-centric dramas like The Departed, Aniston was proving that stories about women were equally profitable. She began to produce and star in projects that challenged the scorned woman trope, effectively rewriting her public identity from the inside out. The pivot to catharsis also involved a literal change in her environment. She sold the Zen mansion she and Pitt had painstakingly renovated, a house that had become a gilded cage for their failing marriage, and moved into a space that was entirely hers. This physical separation was symbolic of her mental shift. She began to speak more openly about the concept of narrative control. She realized that the media would always try to write her story for her, so she decided to become the editor-in-chief of her own life. This era exposed the myth of the Hollywood victim. Aniston showed that a public betrayal doesn't have to be the end of a story. It can be the inciting incident for a much larger, more impressive second act. Her business savvy during this time was unparalleled. She signed lucrative deals with brands like Smartwater and Aveeno, creating a lifestyle image that felt accessible and healthy. She became the woman every other woman wanted to have a drink with, rather than the woman every woman felt sorry for. By the late 2000s, the pivot to catharsis was complete. Aniston had successfully decoupled her value from her marital status. She exposed the reality that a woman's success doesn't need to be validated by a husband or a traditional family structure. She was thriving, not in spite of her divorce, but because of the clarity it provided. She had learned that the only person who could truly expose or protect her was herself. As we analyze this shift, it becomes clear that Jennifer's greatest revenge wasn't a scathing interview or a new boyfriend. It was her longevity. While the Angelina era became increasingly chaotic and eventually ended in its own public explosion, Aniston remained the steady, reliable son of Hollywood. She had pivoted from the girl who got dumped to the woman who owns the studio, and in doing so, she exposed the ultimate truth of celebrity. The best way to win the game is to stop playing by everyone else's rules. The smoke of the mid-2000s fire finally cleared, revealing two people who had grown up in entirely different directions. The long game, forgiveness, and 20 years of hindsight. If time is a healer for Jennifer Aniston and Brad Pitt, it has also been a master editor. 2 decades after their divorce, the dust of the 2005 tabloid explosion has finally settled, revealing a landscape that looks nothing like the Team Jen vs. Team Angelina battlefield of the past. In 2025, with Aniston reflecting from the vantage point of her mid-50s and Pitt having navigated a second public divorce and a journey towards sobriety, the story of their fallout has shifted from a tragedy of betrayal to a study in adult accountability. This is the era of the long game, a period where the exposure of Pitt's flaws was met not with Aniston's resentment, but with his own admission of guilt. The most public signifier of this shift occurred 5 years ago at the 2020 SAG Awards, an event that remains the wrist grab heard round the world. When Pitt reached for Aniston's hand backstage, it wasn't just a photo op, It was a cultural surrender. For 15 years, the media had insisted on a narrative of permanent estrangement. That one moment exposed the truth. They had become buddies. Aniston has since confirmed this in recent interviews, including her 2025 reflections for Vanity Fair and Harper's Bazaar, where she describes the former drama as a leather shoe, something old, worn out, and largely irrelevant to her current life. However, the path to this friendship required a specific kind of reckoning from Pitt. Reports throughout the early 2020s detailed a series of private apologies he made to Aniston during his journey through sobriety. He reportedly took full ownership for being an absentee husband, admitting that he had been stoned and bored for much of the end of their marriage. This is perhaps the most profound exposure of the entire saga. It wasn't Aniston who exposed him in the end, it was Pitt himself, acknowledging that the golden boy persona of the early 2000s was a mask for a man who wasn't emotionally present. This admission effectively validated everything Aniston had hinted at in her sensitivity chip era. By taking responsibility, Pitt finally allowed the sad Jen narrative to die, replacing it with the reality of two humans who simply weren't equipped to handle the pressure of their own myth. In 2025, Aniston is using her platform to correct the most damaging part of the 20-year-old exposure, the selfish workaholic myth. In a landmark interview this year, she spoke candidly about the PTSD of that era, particularly the relentless speculation that she chose her career over children. She finally pulled back the veil on her private struggles with IVF during the exact years her marriage was ending. "They didn't know my story," she told Harper's Bazaar. By exposing her medical history now, she has retroactively dismantled the tabloid's primary weapon. The world now sees that while Pitt was finding himself with a co-star, Aniston was privately battling for a family she was being publicly accused of rejecting. Today, their lives have moved into entirely different spheres of domestic bliss. Pitt is currently in a committed, low-key relationship with Ines de Ramon, a pairing characterized by the very privacy he lacked in the 2000s. Meanwhile, Aniston has settled into a life of quiet power. She has become a vocal critic of the toxic media culture she once fronted, calling out the anonymous schmucks on social media who have replaced the paparazzi of the 2000s. She has replaced the need for a partner with a sanctuary of private life, filled with deep female friendships and professional autonomy. The 20-year hindsight exposes a final, unexpected truth. Jennifer Aniston didn't just survive the divorce, she won the narrative by outgrowing it. She no longer feels the need to correct the record because, as she noted in October, the news cycle is so fast, it just goes away. The exposure of Brad Pitt, his initial callousness, his subsequent apologies, and his eventual sobriety served as the catalyst for her to become unsinkable. She proved that closure isn't a conversation you have with an ex-husband. It's a house you build for yourself, far away from the cameras. The unsinkable legacy. Ultimately, the story of Jennifer Aniston and Brad Pitt is the story of how Hollywood's most scrutinized woman reclaimed the rights to her own life. For decades, the media used their divorce as a blueprint for female tragedy, casting Aniston as the woman who was left behind. But as we look at her standing in 2025, a powerhouse producer, a champion for women's health, and a survivor of the industry's most predatory era, it is clear that the tragedy was an illusion. Aniston exposed the truth that a woman's worth is not a currency to be traded between husbands. She survived the sensitivity chip comments, the Team Jen t-shirts, and the heart-wrenching fertility rumors by simply outlasting the noise. She allowed Pitt to have his public apologies and his path to redemption, but she never made her happiness dependent on his growth. She took the piñata role the media gave her and turned it into a mogul's throne. As the cameras finally stopped flashing on this particular chapter, the takeaway is simple. Jennifer Aniston didn't just expose Brad Pitt's flaws, she exposed the world's obsession with a woman's pain. And by refusing to be defined by that pain, she became the one thing the tabloids never saw coming: happy, whole, and entirely her own. Now, the professional lives of Jennifer Aniston and Brad Pitt reflect a complete divergence from the golden couple mold of the early 2000s. Aniston has moved from tabloid victim to industry titan, now commanding a $320 million business empire. Her return to television as both the lead and executive producer of the morning show has redefined her career. Earning a staggering $2 million per episode, she is one of the highest-paid women in the history of the medium. Beyond the screen, her hair care brand, Jolie, has evolved into a powerhouse generating over $80 million in annual sales, proving that her brand equity is rooted in authentic longevity rather than fading nostalgia. Pitt, meanwhile, remains one of the few traditional movie stars whose presence can still greenlight a summer blockbuster. In 2025, his high-octane drama F1, for which he reportedly earned a $30 million upfront salary, became a cornerstone of Apple TV's cinematic strategy. While he sold a 60% stake in his production company, Plan B, for hundreds of millions, he remains its chairman, steering a ship that consistently produces Oscar-caliber content. Yet, the most significant shift is in their collaboration. In a landscape where they are no longer pitted against each other, they have become strategic allies in the streaming wars. Both stars have found their modern homes at Apple TV+, turning the platform into a prestige haven for Gen X icons. While they occasionally cross paths at industry galas like the SAG Awards, their connection is now defined by professional respect rather than personal drama. They are no longer a love triangle headline. They are the dual architects of modern Hollywood, proving that the most successful way to move on is to out-earn and outproduce the past. Aniston didn't just survive the world's most public divorce. She outplayed the narrative entirely, proving that the best way to expose the past is to build a future that no longer needs it. And for more deep dives into the stories that redefined Hollywood, don't forget to subscribe.